Hello ladies and gentlemen, MarauderEX here with the rant video. Feels long overdue, I guess. Let's talk about the Polymega. For those of you who don't know, Polymega was a modular console that was supposed to be this awesome amalgamation of software emulation and hardware emulation through FPGA, which is an acronym for Field Programmable Gate Array, which is a fancy way of saying we're making hardware that pretends to be other hardware. It's weird. FPGA is really complicated, and I don't know nearly enough about it to try to super condense it, let alone actually get into the details of it. That's something that I really suggest people start looking into, because what I've looked into from this is just it is a very deep rabbit hole. But this console was a modular console that the base console had a CD unit, but then it had these modules that could link to it and allow you to play other consoles. So you could take one section off and put a new section on, and that new section could have NES. Then you could take the NES off and put the SNES, or the Genesis, or the TurboGrafx, whatever. And that's an interesting concept, because it allowed you to play the actual games on modern hardware with modern outputs, so that you could connect it to an HD TV, and it would upscale to a degree. Like it would handle a lot of the post-processing needed, so that you could play the actual games on a newer TV without having to fiddle with weird connections or suffer a loss in quality, because modern TVs just really aren't that equipped to deal with retro signals. And as someone who's looked into things like the FrameMeister and the OSSC and things like that, that was an interesting concept for me. And then there was a bunch of other things, like you could just live stream directly to Twitch and things like that. There's a bunch of features, and I was interested, but hesitant at first, because it seemed like most of what they were going to do is stuff that's already been done. Would have NES, SNES, Genesis, TurboGrafx, etc. The console, the base itself, because it had CD unit, it would be able to do like PS1, Sega CD, TurboGrafx CD, things like that. And like, okay, these are things that, are mostly doable elsewhere. So depending on whatever the price point was going to be kind of hit or miss for people who already have a setup similar to mine, people who've already invested in things like the FrameMeister or OSSC. It's not quite as worthwhile, because you have the actual hardware already hooked up. And with FPGA, that was probably going to be rather expensive, because there are several FPGA consoles out there that upscale, classic NES to HD, and it's expensive, to say the least, because that's expensive technology. And the system kind of launched, and I say kind of because it's not really a launch, it's kind of a self-made crowdfunding exercise. Instead of using crowdfunding through Kickstarter or Indiegogo, it's just giving them money, and if they get enough money, they will go into production. And that is a kind of red flag in itself, because I don't know what their terms of service are for that. If they don't get the full amount, they need like $500,000. If they don't get the full amount, do they just issue everyone a refund and be done with it? In the meantime, like, what do they do with the money? What's happening to the money? The money's just sitting in an account, generating what little bit of interest, but then you just give everyone the money back, or do you just take the money and try to... There's a lot of questions. And then their launch trailer came out, and it raised even more questions. Their launch trailer said that Sega Saturn was going to be the next console that they were going to have, and because the CD unit is part of the base console, that'd be playable right out of the box. You wouldn't have to order or get or wait for another module to play Sega Saturn. Just doable. And that raised some questions because Sega Saturn emulation is weird. So, yeah. And then there was announcement that the Sega Saturn footage for Sega Rally that they used in the video was from the arcade version of Sega Rally, not the Saturn version, which was listed by them as an honest mistake. And I get there are two sides to that. There's one that's the, you know, a lot of video footage for games like this, or for trailers like this, mostly anything video footage in a video, it's typically added in post-production because trying to record a screen is really difficult. So a lot of times they just add post-production video content. But at the same time, nowadays you have capture devices. That's what I do. Like, I am just some schmuck on YouTube who has like a capture card. I can get video footage from any console that I own. Like, there's a lot of questions of why didn't they just use footage from their own console? It's really easy to record. Why didn't they just do that? And that's the thing that I'm kind of siding with. Why didn't they just use their own footage and then add that in post-production? Like, they didn't have to show it working live. They could just use their own footage of the console as post-production, but they didn't. So that's a couple of red flags there. And then the biggest of all red flags kind of came up. Nintendo Life did an article, and there was a lot of damage control for that I don't think actually worked as damage control. The Nintendo Life article basically said that they are removing FPGA from all of the modules. So there is going to be no FPGA at all. It's all basically software emulation. Which, there are a lot of software emulators that are really good. Hygen, or what used to be known as BeastNES, is basically a cycle-accurate SNES emulator. However, it was kind of hefty for just the SNES. And, you know, strides have been made to make it more playable on lower-end hardware and things like that. But Saturn emulation for a long time was really, really rough. To put it nicely, it was rough. Things have actually gotten better in the last couple of years, actually. After this incident, I started looking into Saturn emulation, and there's a lot of strides taken to Saturn emulation to get it playable on lower-end devices. Even there's an iOS and Android Saturn emulator that's actually somewhat playable, which is impressive. Considering I remember when it was not playable on a high-end PC, and the number of hurdles needed in order to get things to work was just frustrating at best. So I was like, okay, without the FPGA, then software emulation, how bad is this? Not too bad. It's better, but the FPGA was really what was the selling point, because you had two different types of emulation. Basically, you had software and hardware, and the hardware could carry the brunt of the processing, and that's not happening now. And the Polymega people have come out and said that was information that's been available on their website forever, and you know, that's nothing that hasn't changed. They haven't issued that there have been some changes to the hardware. They've gone from a slower quad-core CPU to a faster dual-core CPU, which is supposed to make things better in terms of emulation, but it's also going to remove certain peripheral features like the live streaming to Twitch automatically. That's not going to be doable. That might be released in an update. They have also said that if they get enough money through the crowdfunding effort, that one of the modules will have FPGA, which would be the Famicom. Not the NES, but the Famicom system will have FPGA. So the thing is, has gone from we want to play games as accurately as possible, but on modern equipment with all of the modern bells and whistles, but have it be as accurate as possible to basically a souped up Retron 5. And I say souped up when there's really no evidence that it's not going to be just the same. Because as much as the Retron 5 is a good system, it's software emulation only. There are a lot of issues from time to time. You can search videos on YouTube of Retron 5, either graphical glitches, audio glitches. Some games just aren't playable on it at all. That's a problem with emulation. Emulation is very rarely 100% perfect. And the FPGA was supposed to be kind of the answer to that, and now that's not part of it. So there's a big question of what's this console's target market now? Because beforehand it was people kind of like me who wanted to be able to play their actual games on hardware without resulting to have to deal with emulation to get a lot of the more fancy bells and whistles to get it playing on a 1080 or higher TV. Like, if you have a 4K TV, I mean, just imagine how some of these games would look on a 4K TV without any sort of post-processing. Yeah, and now it's not. And then following the story some more, I noticed that there was some conversation about how devices like the EverDrives will not work on this device because they've taken a very, very strict stance on ROMs and piracy, even though one of the features of the console is being able to take your copy of the game, putting it in the console, and actually ripping the ROM to the console so you can take the game out and just have it on your console, and that way you don't have to keep switching out games. Like, that's basically just ripping the ROM from the game, isn't it? Like, I've heard that there's some of the EverDrives will still be able to play, but they can't rip the ROMs because it's not the same. And I've heard that it's not playable at all. So I'm waiting to hear some more information on that, but both of those have cropped up, so I don't know what's accurate. But the more I see of this, the more I'm thinking that this is just another console that is really, really trying to overreach with what they want to do and miss the mark entirely as a result. Having a device that allows you to play your games without worrying about the hardware failure, because that's a big thing that worried me. Is I've got a lot of older disc-based consoles. What happens when the disk drive goes bad? Then I can't play it anymore. I have to get another console, but there's only so many Sega Saturns still out in existence. What happens when, like, over the next, 10, 15, 20 years, they're just going to start dwindling in numbers very quickly. So having these newer consoles, they're like, oh yes, it can do all of these things, this is great, and, that way you can still play your games without having to worry about the hardware failing. But you can also play it on newer TVs, you have a lot of newer bells and whistles, and now that's not accurate. It's like, why not just play on the original hardware at this point? Aside from the original hardware being maybe slightly more rare, but also probably around the same price point from what they're asking. Because it's, like $250 for the console, and then each module is in the price range of $60. That's a bit much per thing, because especially since there's no FPGA. But granted, the FPGA should make it, in theory, more expensive, because it's harder to deal with. But anyway, I just have to say I've become really disenchanted with this idea. I saw this as being an interesting concept, and then once they started talking about what they wanted to do with it, it's like, you know what, that's actually a good idea. This is something that I could get behind technology-wise, This is something that, people who didn't want to shell out a ton of money for, a FrameMeister, the actual hardware, the best cables for connections, because, you can get into things like RGB or VGA for like the Dreamcast. There's a lot of secondary products. This console also has wireless controllers, and but it also allows you to use the actual controllers from that console. So like if you want to use a Super Nintendo controller for your Super Nintendo games, you can, because it's got the connector ports there. Like there were a lot of interesting features to this, and it seems like all of them are being dropped in order just to get something out. And I don't think that it's going to work out positively. The more I see of it, the more I'm like, okay, this is just kind of crashing and burning. Especially since a lot of people are complaining that the PR is the biggest problem. The issue with the Saturn video and the weird responses coming from that. The EverDrive discussion and talking about ROMs on their forums was a bad thing. And then discussing the crowdfunding aspects of this were not well received. And so it's like a big part of it is their PR department seems to be dropping the ball. And what do they want to do with this? What is their actual goal versus what they're trying to do? Because it seems like what they want to do is this huge, lofty idea that would be amazing. Just from the sound of it, would probably be prohibitively expensive, which is why they're not going for it. So they're settling for something that's a few steps behind that. In which case, it's nowhere near what they're actually wanting to do at the end of the day. And instead of making it very clear about what they're doing, they've made it clear very early on as to what they wanted to do, and they haven't been directly hiding things, but they've been very obtuse and very, that's on a blog post that no one saw that we talked about 6 months ago. I don't know why people, like, that's the kind of PR that's coming across. So I'm just gonna say I was really interested in this concept early on, and the more and more I see of it, the more disappointed I am in it, and the less likely that I would be willing to invest in it. So, for those of you who don't know, go check out the Polymega, see what you think. It might be something that you could be interested in, but if you're going for software-only emulation, there are other ways to do that. There are cheaper ways to do that. There are more customizable ways to do that to get your most bang for your buck. And while this does kind of put it all into an all-in-one package so that you don't have to do the effort for you, it could be that it's overpriced for what you're getting, or it could be that, a little bit of time, done doing some research and tinkering with the hardware on your end could save you a ton of money and get you better results. So, yeah, if you're going to stick with software-only emulation, there are so many other ways to do that. You could mod a modern you could go back and buy a Wii for $50 and mod it and play a good deal of those consoles on a Wii. That's a truth to it, which is weird. Let me know your thoughts about the Polymega. Are you interested? Are you not? Confused as I am? What? Because this is interesting. It's interesting to watch this unfold. It really is. It's either going to be a case study of what not to do in PR or what not to do in business management. Or both. Who knows? So, let me know your thoughts, and I will see you in my next rant. So, till then, later, everyone.